after 30 years of dreaming, 2 years of wondering, a year's worth of saying, well, maybe. After a year and a half of saying, yeah, I think this might be a God thing. After 40 days of silence and saying farewell to an instrument that has served us so well for so long. After 7 weeks of cricks in our neck as we keep coming in and checking to see what's going on there at the back of the sanctuary. After the fasting from organ music, and now on this day, after all this time, after all of this waiting and hoping and praying, here we are, singing with this new instrument that is different in this space, isn't it? It fills this space differently, and it has different tones and textures than we are used to. It lets us sing in ways that we haven't necessarily known that we can, and different ways for us. It's filling our hearts and our souls, and it will continue to shape us in different ways. And I got to tell you, in all of the preparation for today, in all of the waiting for this, in the imagining of that pregnant moment, that pause between the gospel acclamation, the Alleluia, in that silence as we waited for John to start the introduction, I started to imagine. And I started to imagine in that silence what that would be like for us as we waited, as the echoes faded and we're waiting to hear these pipes for the first time. And I started to wonder what that would be like for us. And then this sort of a little twisted side of my mind started wondering, boy, what would it be like if in the middle of that pregnant moment, as we're waiting, all of a sudden someone, I'm not saying who, someone were to go, So previous service, I couldn't see how hard Pastor is shaking her head at me, but it's probably good that I have people who talk me out of such things. But I've decided to blame it on April Fool's Day, as though that's the reason I think of such things. It is, after all, April Fool's Day. Easter Sunday falling on April Fool's Day has not happened since 1956. And it will not happen again until 2029. So we have to enjoy it a little bit while we can. Not till 2029 we have to wait. And it's too bad, really, that it happens so infrequently. Because every 3 years, we have the chance to hear this version of the Easter story from the Gospel of Mark. And every time we read it or hear it, it feels like it ought to be April Fool's Day, doesn't it? I mean, seriously, Jesus can't be bothered to show up at his own resurrection. There's no Jesus here. All we have is some random anonymous guy dressed in white, sitting in a tomb, over on the right, kicking his heels and waiting as these 3 poor, broken-hearted women show up. No Jesus. All we have are 3 women who, at the end of the story, go running out. They've been given 2 commands. Don't be afraid. Go and tell, and they can't do either of them. All we're left with is watching and waiting as these women go running with wide eyes, and we wait to see if they're going to do anything for. That's how it ends. In fact, in the Greek, in the way that this is written, it's even more, stretches us out even a little bit more. It says, and they said nothing to nobody. It says, they were very afraid, you see, for ... That's how it ends. They said nothing to nobody. They were very afraid, you see, for... And I mean, seriously, what kind of resurrection is this? This is not the way you run a resurrection. We came here looking for Jesus. We came here looking for the lilies. We came here looking for the bright lights. And we came here looking for victory and triumph. Jesus in shiny armor, standing on top of the tomb with a sword, knocking soldiers down just by the pure sight of him. We expected to see angels in flashing colors. We wanted the stone to rumble as it's rolled away. We were expecting the best. We come to Easter so we can be the bestest version of ourselves, right? Hear something great. Experience something wonderful. Go home the gooder version of ourselves so we can try just a little bit harder, be just a little bit better, and we can be a little bit more what we want to be in the world. That's why we're here, right? And they said nothing to nobody. They were very afraid, you see, for this is no way to run a resurrection. Jesus can't even be bothered to show up. All we're left with at the end of Mark here is the echoes. The echoes of a voice as it's bouncing around in an empty tomb. The echoes of a voice that says, "Do not be afraid." Well, now that's our first hint that God has done something here, because every time God steps into the world, that's what we need to be reminded. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid. You came looking for the dead guy. He's not here. He's alive. And he's loose out in the world. Do not be afraid, but go. Go and tell the disciples. And then there's that little aside. And Peter. Mark really wants to make sure, the angel really wants to make sure that Peter knows this is for him. Go and tell the disciples and Peter. After everything that's happened, go tell Peter to go back to Galilee. Jesus is going ahead of you, and you will see him there just like he told you. Go back to Galilee. Back to Galilee. Back where it all began. Go back to the beginning, where in Mark chapter 1 we heard that this story is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ. Go back to Galilee, where you spent all that time with Jesus and came to know him. Go back to Galilee, where ordinary life is. Go back to the world that's waiting for you and that you know best. Go back to where you know you belong. Jesus is going ahead of you, and you will see him there just like he told you. Go back to the beginning, because with God, it is always a beginning. It doesn't matter if it's the end of the world. With God, it's always a beginning. Because that's exactly what Easter is. It is the end of the world that's been trying to pull the wool over our eyes so stridently, so shrilly, so panic-stricken that we might see beyond it and see a deeper truth. The world that wants us to believe that might makes right. That so desperately wants us to believe that the ends always justify the means. The world that so desperately wants us to believe that the one who dies with the most toys wins. Easter is the end of that world, because that is not the truth, and we know better. Even when the world ends, it is only a beginning for God. Or when your world ends, it is always a beginning with God. Whether it's a pink slip, a doctor's whispered diagnosis, whether it's paperwork filed in court, whether it's the kids moving out or the kids moving back in, or that phone call in the middle of the morning when it's still dark and nobody should be calling you at that hour. Even when it is the end of your world with God, there is always a beginning, because that's who our God is. We come to Easter where we know and expect we've stashed Jesus away. He's there in the tomb, and we can come and see him glorious, see him shiny, see him triumphant. And instead, what we have today are the echoes of a voice rattling around an empty tomb. Echoes of a voice that change us because we have seen the empty tomb. We came looking for the dead guy, the one marked by what we did. And instead, we hear a voice that says, go and tell. Go and tell. Go back to the beginning. Go back to where you have learned about Jesus. Go back to ordinary life. Jesus is going ahead of you. He's already there. It means we can't predict him. We never know where he's going to show up. But go back to the beginning with eyes that have seen the empty tomb and tell. Go and tell. Through this season, we've been learning from the recovery community about freedom in their 12-step process. And today, we've come to that 12th step, which says, you only know it when you teach it. Go and tell, not just for those in your life who are dying to know what this world really is, but go tell for your own sake too. We came looking for the tomb. We came looking for Jesus where we stashed him away. We came so that we could be lifted up and that better version of ourselves, and instead what we have seen is an empty tomb. The echoes of a voice. We've seen and heard those words that say, go back to the beginning, because with God it is always a beginning. Alleluia. Christ is risen.
Christ is risen.